Had to step away for a minute there, actually a whole day. Um, got interrupted during my Locke presentation there. But I'm wearing the same shirt, so um, maintained continuity. Um, we just been finished talking about the state of war and the state of slavery. Um, and next comes the chapter on property. Chapter 5 on property gets to the core of Locke's theory. Um, his idea on property is foundational. The, the basic idea is the key to political legitimacy and prosperity is a natural right to property. But by property, he means something unique, uh, not the traditional understanding. When we think of property, we think of possessions. Um, Locke's definition includes that, but it's broader, and that broader conception is critical for his argument for a natural right to private property. So here's the way it goes. Um, he says, God owns us, as our maker. God owns us. We're God's property. But God has given us proprietorship over ourselves. Proprietor, a proprietor of a shop or something. Somebody else owns the shop, but the proprietor has full operational control, right, over the business. So God has given us proprietorship over ourselves. Therefore, we have property in ourselves, in our lives. Therefore, we have property in what we do with ourselves, with our minds and our bodies, or in other words, with our liberty. Therefore, we have a property in what we gather to ourselves through the use of our liberty. So the property in the full sense is life, liberty, and Locke calls it estate to distinguish it from the other types of property. Estate meaning possessions. It specifically has land in mind at this point, but it's life, liberty, and estate together is property in the complete sense. And having protecting that is the key to self-preservation. In other words, uh, Locke, Locke's self-preservation is conceived more broadly than Hobbes. Hobbes' self-preservation is about preserving your life, literally against violent death, right? Locke says that's not nearly enough security. You need to have security not only in your life, but also in your liberty and in your property, what you gather to yourself through your free labor. That's the way property is established. You, you recall his the way people originally acquire property and a right to exclusive ownership is by mixing their labor with nature. So there's that example of the acorn guy picks up was it an acorn or also fruit. So he's out in the wild. Nobody owns this particular piece of land. Picks up an acorn or an apple or whatever, and and ends up eating it. And Locke says, well, when did it become his property? Was it when he ingested it? Was it when he brought it to his mouth? Wouldn't it make sense to say it was his as soon as he picked it up for himself? And then you apply that to, say, a piece of land. Like, so if there is unclaimed territory out somewhere, and the land is lying uncultivated, and you cultivate that land, you have, by doing that, you have made it your own. You have a right to own that land. Nobody else has a right to own it now. or take it away from you. Um, and that is the way your right to that property is established. Um, now, of course, in Europe and in England, all of the property has already been taken up. So that raises further questions. We know that Locke was thinking partly about the New World. In fact, he mentions in the chapter on property America as an example, the New World at the time, of a state of nature, and he says, in the beginning, all the world was America. But at this point, all the world is not America, right? One of the implications of this is one of the things he's doing is he's making an argument for um, appropriating land in excuse me, land in the New World. He's well aware of the fact that there are people over there. There are people living on that land, but they're nomadic. They're hunter gatherers. They're moving around all the time. They haven't cultivated the land. I mean, there are some tribes who are agrarian, but um, and so this is one application of this is to say that well, look, if they're not using that land, if they're not making use of it, then it's free for the taking. Um, so anyway, um, the along with this this idea of property comes Locke's theory of economic growth, you could say. It's been called the labor theory of value. Right. The idea is that um, something, the value of something to human beings is determined by the labor put into it. Right. So again, think of that field, uncultivated field out there. If nobody's cultivated it, it's not very productive. You can go pick a few berries, maybe hunt a few animals in there, but if you cultivate it, if you plow some fields, plant some grain, grow some crops, you increase the productivity of that land 10, 100, 1,000-fold. You can feed not only yourself and your family, but thousands of others potentially. And what was it that made the difference? It was labor, labor that made the difference. And this is a budding conception of the possibilities for economic growth, sort of the kernel of the idea of how it can work. And then Locke goes on to suggest that really economics should be the primary concern of government. We go on and talk about how protection of property is the end of government, the purpose of government. And so political rulers ought to prioritize facilitating economic growth. And they could best do this, Locke suggests, through protection of property rights and through encouraging productive labor. Now, one of the things that comes up in this chapter is the rise of a money economy, and the invention of money and the money economy changes the dynamics a little bit, right? Locke had said there are limits on the right to property in nature. There are natural limits, and that limit is you should only acquire as much as you can use. So, if you store up a bunch of apples, you don't eat them before they rot, then you're wasting. Sort of kind of crime against nature. so to speak. But money changes the dynamics. Money doesn't spoil like that. And you could use that money to buy large uh, tracts of land that nobody's using right now, but that are available for becoming useful to someone who has the right price. Uh, so, and one of the implications of this, the results of this, uh, is an increasing inequality among people. Um, there's going to be an inequality anyway, to the extent that some people are going to be more, to use his words, industrious and rational than others. But the money economy is going to cause much greater disparity in wealth than would have been caused just by um, people going out there, rolling up their sleeves, and plowing some land. Um, and um, Locke doesn't seem to be too bothered by this inequality that will develop, um, and it doesn't really go into inequality, economic inequality, as a problem. Rousseau will. I'll probably make a video on Rousseau for you uh, shorter. Um, but for Rousseau, inequality is problem number one. Rousseau is the cause of, fundamentally, the cause of social uh, ills of various kinds, and in particular, economic inequality. Um, and he's going to um, question the assumption that um, the benefits of economic growth simply go to the industrious and rational. Uh, Implicitly say, isn't it more complicated than that? I mean, maybe some people get their wealth through hard work and ingenuity, but maybe not all of them, um, and maybe some of the inequalities are unfair, result of um, um, underhanded practices or unearned special privileges, such as was the case in France um, in Rousseau's time. The legacy of feudalism was hanging on. There were all kinds of titles and all kinds of wealth that came with those titles that was not based on merit, it was based on what family you came from and so forth. So anyway, so that's a problem to keep your heads up, keep your eyes peeled for. Um, so anyway, you know, um, remember, property is at the core of all this, and that will cause everything else to fall into place. So okay, so he's talked about the state of nature here. Property, you have a right to property in the state of nature, right? Because it's naturally acquired. Um, and um, but again, uh, even if you've been able to acquire some property and make it productive and so forth, there are these marauders or whoever out there in the state of nature who are going to make life difficult for the best of you. You're just trying to get along and um, and live your lives, and you're going to have to um, get out of this situation. You're going to have a government. Um, and this sets up the question of the social contract. Um, so Locke agrees with Hobbes. The answer is some kind of contract. Locke calls it a compact. Hobbes called it a covenant. Um, but they agreed that's the way out of this insecurity of the state of nature. However, the nature of the contract is different. Hobbes had said in the contract, um, everyone would have to surrender all their rights in the state of nature, their entire um, personal sovereignty into the hands of whoever it is that they're going to put in charge. Um, whereas Locke says it's only a partial surrender and a conditional surrender of uh, mutual surrender of sovereignty. Right. A second point is that um, for Hobbes, whoever is chosen by the people in agreeing to this contract is not party to the contract. The ruler, the person who becomes sovereign, cannot be bound down by anything, by any law, but not even by the fundamental contract. Uh, he must not be bound in any way because he must have power to do whatever it takes to um, um, secure the situation for everyone, up to and including killing people, right? So he has not surrendered that right to use violence um, um, and to exercise the right of nature. The Hobbes's ruler, Hobbes's sovereign, is still in a state of nature in relation to the people who have put him in charge. The difference here is that this is a state of nature you can live with, especially if, and this is really key for Hobbes, that this sovereign is well educated in Hobbesian principles, so he understands that it's in his own self-interest to not turn his power against the people, except for purposes of maintaining the peace. Right, but Locke is not convinced that that's workable at all. He doesn't think that uh, um, that's anywhere near sufficient security against a sovereign turning his power against the people for his own personal aggrandizement. Um, and so Locke said every person must be party to the contract. Every single person who is going to be a participant in this society must be party to the contract. And that leads to the second part of it. In Locke's contract, the government is not established as part of the contract. The fundamental social contract just creates the political community. The creation of the government comes later, as a later step. For Hobbes, the sovereign is set up by the contract. The sovereign comes into existence, or his existence is established by the contract. Not for Locke. And for Locke, that's important because under Hobbes' theory, if the if the sovereign power breaks down, if the government loses control, there's a successful rebellion or whatever, then the artificial person created by the contract, as Hobbes had put it, is dead, and it's back to every man for himself. But Locke says, now if you have the people existing prior to the government, apart from the government, the people remain the people, even if the government breaks down. And this is important for what's coming next. And then Locke clarifies what's to come by specifying certain things about the reason we need to leave the state of nature that will set up the thinking about the government. Yeah, of course, insecurity is the basic reason, but more specifically, the problem in the state of nature is an absence of effective legislative, executive, and judicial power, the essential powers of government, in other words. And so the government that is set up must have the proper powers in place, set up the right way. So the first question about justice is what is the purpose first question about government is what is the purpose of government? And the purpose of government is protection of property. Remember, life, liberty, and estate. That is the purpose of government, right? And this purpose or this this achievement is a moral obligation, right? For Locke, there is justice in the state of nature. There is a natural justice, and therefore there is such a thing as good and bad government. Right? Hobbes denied that. Right? Um, there's the good and bad are just words for things that you like or don't like. But Locke agrees with Aristotle that there is an objective criterion for distinguishing between good governments and bad governments, just governments and unjust governments. The only difference is that, and it's a significant difference, but the difference is that for Locke, the objective criterion is the protection of life, liberty, and property, whereas for Aristotle it was virtue, right? So big implications there, but it is notable that there's an objective criterion for Locke. By the way, Locke does not deny, speaking of virtue, Locke does not deny the need for virtue or even the existence of souls. He just leaves souls out of the political discussion altogether. And the reason is he doesn't think it's relevant to politics. We'll talk about that in a minute. He just doesn't think the soul and virtues are the proper jurisdiction of government. So we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But the key understanding of the people's relationship to the government is that government is, this is an important word in Locke, government is a trust. The people have sovereignty. The people exist prior to the government. They are the sovereign power. They maintain their sovereignty, latently at least, right? Sometimes actively in election time, but they loan sovereignty, you can say, they loan power and sovereignty to the government conditionally, right, as a trust. They are entrusting government with this power and authority to use it as they intended it to be used to protect their life, liberty, and estate. If the government fails to do that, or if it actually actively violates those rights, people have a right to remove that power and authority from the government. Right? Government is a trust. Actually, at some place makes it pretty clear. He has in mind an economic analogy, a fiduciary trust. If you know what a fiduciary trust is, say you're a young child, 5 years old. You and your parents die in a car accident or something, and your parents were wealthy. They left behind a big fortune, but you're 5 years old. You're not capable of handling money and so forth. So those possessions, that wealth is put in trust. There's some executor of the estate that will keep that wealth until you're prepared to use it, but it remains yours, right? That's the idea. Fiduciary trust of a kind here, and this implies that the government is limited. Right? It has its power on loan. It has its sovereignty on loan. Sovereignty just means, by the way, supreme authority, right? And Locke, of course, thinks that Hobbes has underestimated the danger of government turning its powers against the people. And further, Locke thinks that a tyrannical government is worse than an ordinary state of nature, because then one person has a monopoly on all of the power. And if he turns it against you, it's much more devastating than it would have been in a state of nature. We at least had a chance. Seemed like, so government must be limited. This leads to the issue of the form of government. What is the right form of government? Or put a different way, meaning the same thing, the right organization of powers of government. Right? That's the form of government. Its It's organization of powers. And you want to organize these powers in such a way that's most conducive to protecting those natural rights, life, liberty, and state. Um, and so that's how he goes into the um, well, what kind of government should that be? Um, how can you check the government and keep it accountable is another way of putting it, right? How can the people do that, uh, given this trust? And Locke's answers are fairly simply summed up. First, there must be a separation of powers, specifically between the legislative and executive power. Because, in other words, the meaning of that is the legislative power and the executive power must be in different hands. You can't have the same people exercising the legislative power and the executive power, because if that happens, there's no way to check um, the government. He doesn't mention separating the judicial power. It will be Montesquieu that really nails that home for the American founders. Um, although Locke seems to treat judicial power as a subset of executive power because the courts are applying the law to these different cases in the way that an executive would be applying the law through executing the law. But there must be a separation of powers. There must be a rule of law. And this means, effectively, that the legislative power is superior to the executive power. It's a government. It's to be a government of laws. And the way John Adams had put it, we have a government of laws and not of men. Right. In other words, it's a government that does not depend on the discretion of the people in charge, but they are bound themselves by laws, by the laws that they pass, by the laws that they execute. It's a rule of law. And the third one, critically, is that the legislators must be elected. The people effectively make their own laws indirectly through their representatives. But the people who make those laws must be elected. He doesn't insist on this for the executive power, but in this government of laws, the legislative power must be in control, and they must be closely tied to the will of the popular sovereign, right? And the best way to do that is through elections. There is a special problem in related to what Locke calls the prerogative power, which is a power of discretion. The, you go back and look at all the Western tradition, what Aristotle said about law and what Thomas Aquinas said about law. One of the problems about law is that it's general. It can't count for every unique situation, and sometimes in a particular situation, the law doesn't provide for that situation, or it doesn't allow for something that absolutely must be done. And that's what he's talking about here. The prerogative power is the power of the executive to go beyond or even against the law when it is in the public interest, when it's necessary for the public good, or Aristotle called it the common good, right? So the most obvious example of this is some kind of emergency situation, the nation being invaded or being attacked, or there's some kind of severe security crisis, and the president has to take some actions that would ordinarily be illegal. These can always be controversial. But you take 9/11 when President Bush gives the order that any more planes that are flying into buildings are going to be shot down before they go into the building. Well, that would be a crime against humanity in peacetime, but in this scenario, that killing of U.S. citizens or citizens of other countries that might be on the plane was considered justified to protect even more lives, right? And people didn't really question that at the time. Um, on a positive side, you could look at the example of Jefferson's uh, taking the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon. Jefferson did not think he had constitutional authority to do that. He was a strict constructionist, um, but it was like, okay, well, Napoleon's not going to wait around for us to have a long legislative debate on this, and we can double size the country for relatively cheap. So it's a no-brainer. I'm just going to do it, right? That would be prerogative power, right? But it does present problems of obviously the power of discretion can be abused. That's the whole reason you have rule of law. Rule of law is to pin people down so they can't use discretion and do just whatever they might think is good for the country or good for themselves. Um, and so it's a tricky problem to handle. Locke does his best, but but then all of this conversation sets up the problem of tyranny, right? Um, Tyranny uh, is for Locke not just a word for government you don't like, as it is for Hobbes. Tyranny is a definable injustice, and Locke's definition of tyranny is the exercise of arbitrary, as opposed to legally authorized, power over others. Um, right? The exercise of an arbitrary will over others. So Locke suggests that absolute power is by definition inherently unjust. So I mean, what this means is Hobbes's system. Um, the sovereign in Hobbes's system is a tyrant, right? And Locke's simple formulation for this is uh, where the law ends, tyranny begins. Right? Now, there's that difficulty, though, of the prerogative power. So we have to be a little more specific. Tyranny is the effort to bring people's lives, liberties, and estates under your absolute control. So if an executive goes above the law, beyond the law, or even against the law, it must be for the sake of preserving uh, life, liberty, and estate. If it does uh, something else, then it would be tyranny. Um, so then it brings everything down to the question of what to do in the case of tyranny, or in the case of developing tyranny, right? Um, and that brings us to Locke's doctrine of the right to revolution. The right to revolution is premised on this understanding of popular sovereignty, right, and of government as a trust from the people. And a just cause for revolution is when the government violates that trust, either through failure, it's too weak to do what needs to be done, or through active violation of those rights, right? So, it's some degree a judgment call, but perhaps there are points where it's pretty clear cut that people's lives, liberties, and estates are being violated by the government. Then another question arises as to what is the appropriate timing for a revolution? How bad should things get, right? And Locke's implicit answer is only after a, quote, long train of abuses, unquote. That is a phrase used for verbatim in the Declaration of Independence. Locke is trying to answer objections of people who are saying this doctrine of a right to revolution is going to cause chaos. I mean, people are going to revolt all the time. And people are always dissatisfied with the government for one reason or another. There's going to be constant revolutions. It's going to undermine the kind of security that you say you want so much. And you can take a look at Locke's answers. But the one I want to highlight is Locke's suggestion that if the people believe in a right to revolution, it will actually make revolution less likely. Right? Because it will make the government more cautious, more hesitant to violate the public trust. Okay, well, that's basically the political theory. I want to say a quick word on Locke's solution to the church-state problem, the religion-politics problem, in his letter concerning toleration. I didn't have you read that, but it's Locke was worried about the same problem as all of these thinkers at the time were. I mean, what do you do with religion? And so Locke's solution is really just two basic elements. One is the separation of church and state, and the other, related, of course, is religious liberty. So taking church and state. So what Locke says is, okay, church and state, what kind of organizations are church and state? Let's define them. And the first fundamental move is the idea that church and state have separate jurisdictions related to different roles. They fundamentally do different kinds of things. And the specific difference is that the state is concerned with matters of the body, protecting the use of the body, and so forth. The church is concerned with matters of the soul. If they will keep to their jurisdictions, things will work out all right. And critical for this is that they have different legitimate means of enforcement. The state can use coercion, raw power, force, to enforce its laws. The church should not. This is critical. The proper means of enforcement of church doctrine is persuasion, admonishment, advice, criticism perhaps, but never the use of force. No corporal punishment. No, requiring, leans in the direction of no requiring people to give their money to a church they don't like. Well, that leads to the second issue, religious liberty. Locke says, okay, well, a church is, and this would have been a controversial definition, I guess. A church is based on a kind of contract. Remember, for Locke, everything is based on explicit or implicit contracts, right? And a church community is a consensual community. It should be. That's the proper definition of it. He says people come together and they agree that they're going to these are the doctrines they believe. This is the way they're going to do things, and so they voluntarily become a part of this community. And while they remain in that community, Locke says they have every right to demand that they stick to those doctrinal beliefs and that they do things the way that the church thinks it should be done. But they're free to leave at any time, right? And if they don't like what the local church is doing, go no one down the street or whatever. And so this is sort of his notion of religious liberty. It's kind of religious voluntarism, right? And I think he wrote this first, well before he wrote the social contract. But the principles, the second treatise, the principles between this notion of a church body and the body politic is exactly the same, essentially. just different enforcement mechanisms, right? Okay, so conclusions on Locke. First, with respect to liberalism, Locke is important as really establishing the form and content of that, those concepts that Hobbes put forth. Uh, yeah, Locke's use of that conceptual framework is what stuck. Um, Second, um, Locke has a lot in common with the realist, you could say. Um, his is a kind of liberal realism, if you will. Think about Locke's interpretation of human behavior. Um, it actually corresponds um, somewhat to Machiavelli's notion of the two humors, right? Everyone is self-interested, but while some people want to dominate others, uh, most people just want to not be dominated. And Machiavelli thought that's just an empirical observation. That's not everybody wants to dominate, and um, so Hobbes was just basically wrong that everybody would want to dominate, and everybody would be a war of every man against every man. He just doesn't think that's the way people are, Locke, and he would be backed up. It seems like by Machiavelli on that point. Um, and Locke's liberalism has kind of some hard edges. Um, it's certainly not a soft-headed version of liberalism. It's tough. It's ready to fight. Um, so, in relation specifically to international politics, you have really Locke presents a vision of security and justice in the international state of nature. I mean, he doesn't talk about the international state of nature, but he explicitly says the international situation is a state of nature. Uh, and and um, and so, if you look at international behavior, um, fitting along with this, not everybody wants to dominate. Most just want to not be dominated. Um, Most nations live together cooperatively. It seems. I mean, look, is there really a fair chance that we'll go to war with Canada anytime soon? Aren't there nations that we really have no interest in, or we have no concern about in terms of security? Um, Nations that have common values, or you know, um, that with which we have certain commercial relations um, that would make war much more costly um, than we want to take on. Um, so, so maybe Hobbes overstated, and maybe that would be true not only between individuals but even between nations. And then there's the point about justice. Um, Justice pertains in the international state of nature, if you're extrapolating from what Locke suggests, right? And there's two elements to this. The first has to do with just cause, right? There is a pretty clearly defined just cause for war for Locke, and that is to defend life, liberty, and the state, right? And the implication is that that's the only legitimate cause, a just cause for war, right? So you have a limit, an implicit limit. And then with regard to just peace, the jus post bellum, while it is legitimate to impose certain constraints on a defeated nation as a deterrent from them, um, you know, being aggressive again, uh, there are limits to what kind of constraints you can put on, what you can do to them in terms of their life, liberty, and estate. All right, that's enough on Locke. I will see you next time.